Welcome. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet, or those of you who are joining us online, really excited to have you with us. What a beautiful day. And today we are wrapping up a conversation called Starting Point. If you haven't been with us for the past 8 weeks, this is one of our longest series we've ever done. For the past 8 weeks, we've been working through this conversation and looking at, okay, what would it look like? What would it look like to have an adult starting point? What would it look like to have an adult starting point to our faith? And many of us had a starting point to our faith. Our parents told us what we believed, and we took that and ran with it. But for many of us, one, we weren't very good listeners. And in addition to that, we encountered, as we engaged life, we encountered questions that we didn't know the answers to. We encountered conversations that we weren't prepared for. And it left us, in terms of our faith journey, it left us in a place where for some of us, we just decided, you know what, I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to believe through it. For others of us, it left us in a place where we said, you know what, I don't really know if I believe it. I don't really know if you can know what you believe. I don't know if anybody can know what they believe. And so you've kind of stuck around that journey of faith, but you don't really believe it. For others of you, you walked away from it entirely and you gave up. You said, no, it's all just a Jedi mind trick. It's not really true. And you walked away from it, but your friend invited you back. And so you've been a part of this conversation with us. And all of us, as we engage life, the reality is, or at least for most of us, as we engage life, the faith journey that we began, it didn't hold up. And then we had to figure out what we were going to do about that. And what we've been doing for the past couple of weeks is coming in and saying, okay, wait. If we were to go back and to restart our faith journey as an adult, knowing the questions, knowing the conversations, knowing what we've experienced with life, what would that look like? Is that even possible? And for the last couple of weeks, we've been walking through that. And so we began with what is probably the most important question for a faith journey if you're going to be a follower of Jesus. We began with this primary question, this cornerstone question, if you will. Who is Jesus? And what are you going to do with the fact that he walked out of that tomb? And then as we moved forward from there, we began to work through some of those difficult questions and conversations of faith. What is actually required for us to have a relationship with God? Is our relationship with God based on our behavior, or is it based on his grace? And we worked through the reality that throughout the entire scripture, God has been coming to us and asking us to do one thing over and over and over and over again, and that is to trust him. We worked through the conversation of grace and what this really means. We walked through the conversation of rules and why are there all the rules, and is it that you have to keep the rules to get in, or is it that you're given the rules because you're in? What does that look like? Is it the club model? Is it the family model? We walked through what it means to actually engage God in the midst of belief. And last week we had this conversation about belief and looked at the reality that if you have enough people who believe the same thing, they're all going to look for the same evidence, and they're going to find evidence of what it is that they think is true. And so is that just what we're doing here, or is there more to it than that? And we left off last week looking at the reality that our journey is actually different. And we looked at the reality that as God steps in, the movement of Jesus doesn't start with a bunch of believe that statements. It doesn't start with a vision that someone had that says, okay, well, this is how you get to God, and so you need to believe that. But that the movement of Jesus actually began with an event. That it actually began with God doing something. What Paul says was God proving something. And that the reason we believe isn't because there was a group of people who believed. The reason we believe is actually because there was a group of people who didn't believe until God did something. And for the past couple of weeks, we've been working through these different conversations and looking at, okay, what actually eliminates our sin and the difference between being a mistaker and a sinner. Again, I encourage you, if you haven't been with us on this journey, I highly encourage you to go back and to listen or watch those conversations. But today, as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to end with one final prediction that Jesus made. And I want to end with what I believe is one final way that Jesus has once again shown us that he is faithful. The prediction was made as Jesus was traveling with his disciples, and the disciple Matthew actually captures it for us in Matthew chapter 16. And as Jesus is traveling with his disciples, they come to a city called Caesarea Philippi. I actually have a picture of Caesarea Philippi. It's not known today for its nightlife. But at one time, this was a thriving city. As a matter of fact, when Jesus was alive, this city was renamed, specifically renamed in honor of Caesar Augustus. Now, some of you know that Caesar Augustus was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was considered to be a deity. He had actually announced himself as being a god. And so Caesar Augustus, the individual that this city was named for, was actually known to be the Son of God, which is interesting as it pertains to the conversation that Jesus and his disciples had as they entered this city. Because as they're entering this city, Matthew captures the story, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, listen, who do you think that who do other people say that I am? And there's an interesting back and forth as the disciples talk about who people say that Jesus is. But then Jesus gets more specific and says, well, but what about you in particular? Who do you think that I am? And Peter responds back and says something remarkable. Verse 16 says this. He says, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, where they are is pretty interesting as it pertains to how Peter responds, because remember, the city that they're walking into is named for the Son of God, the son of Julius Caesar, but specifically the dead God. And Peter says, no, I know who you are. You're the Messiah, you're the Christ, you're the one who's been sent to rescue us, and you're the Son of the living God. Jesus turns back to him and says, Peter, you didn't come up with this on your own. The Father's actually shared that with you. And then as he continues, he makes a prediction. He makes a promise. Listen to what he says. Verse 18, he says, and on this rock, I will build my church. Now, what the rock is, there's a little bit of back and forth about. He's not talking about an actual rock. Now, some people think that he's talking about Peter, and he's saying, okay, Peter, I'm going to use you to actually do what it is that I'm going to do. Some people think that it's actually about the statement that you are the Messiah, the Christ. Listen, on that truth, I'm going to do what it is that I'm going to do. It doesn't really matter which one it actually is. The more important thing is that in this moment, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, listen, I want you to not only understand who I am, but I also want you to understand what it is that I'm going to do. And throughout his life, Jesus has been making all sorts of predictions about the fact that he's going to die and that he's going to come back to life. Last week as we ended, we talked about the fact that he had predicted his death and resurrection and actually pulled it off, which is what makes our journey so different in terms of what it is that we believe and why it is that we believe. But Jesus doesn't just talk about how he's going to die and come back to life. He also makes another prediction, and that is this. After I do that, I'm going to build something. I'm going to build something. Now, this word church, unfortunately, is actually a pretty significant error in terms of translation. What I mean by that is this. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. Matthew actually wrote in Greek. And as Matthew's trying to capture what it is that Jesus predicted, he uses a very common Greek word. As a matter of fact, it would have been used in common day speech. It was not a religious word in any way, shape, or form. He uses a Greek word called ekklesia. Ekklesia specifically means, it's just a word for an assembly or a congregation, a group of people. And as Matthew is trying to capture what it is that Jesus said, he says, Jesus promised that he was going to build this ekklesia. Now, unfortunately, as translations happen, this word church, the word that we use for church, actually comes from a German word. And that German word got substituted for the word ecclesia. Now, I'm not going to share with you the German word, mainly because anytime you use German, it sounds like you're cursing at someone else. But then also because Germans don't like it when you mispronounce their words. But this word church actually comes from a German word that doesn't mean a gathering. It actually means house of the Lord. Now, one of the reasons why this is a problematic translation is because even today, some of you still think church and you think of a place as opposed to a people. Even to this point today, we still struggle with this because of the fact that there was this mistake in terms of translation. And we stick with this word church, but it's important for you to understand when he says, listen, I'm going to build my church, he's not talking about a place, he's talking about a group of people. And he says, listen, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this prediction. I'm going to make this promise to you. Now, at the time, as the disciples are walking into the city, and it's just the 13 of them, I have to imagine that they're thinking, okay, how is that going to happen? And it doesn't seem very likely that's going to happen because at this point they're actually outlaws. They're afraid to even go to Jerusalem because if they go to Jerusalem, Jesus is going to be put to death. But Jesus says, no, guys, I want you to understand not just that I'm going to die and that I'm going to come back, but that I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to build this congregation. I'm going to build this movement. A short time later, as we talked about last week, Jesus is actually put to death. And at that point, it definitely doesn't look like it's going to happen. Looks like any chance of that ecclesia, of that movement, of that people coming together has been eliminated. But then something happened. And Jesus walks out of that tomb, and as he encounters his disciples again, he shares this with them. Again, Matthew, the same one who gave us the prediction, also shares this moment with us. And remember, Jesus has already come back from the dead, so that prediction has already come true, and he calls them together, and listen to what it is that he says to them. Matthew chapter 28, it says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.'" Now, this is a pretty arrogant statement. And for those of you who interact with Jesus and think, man, he was just a nice teacher. He just taught some really nice things. You have to really wrestle through moments like this where Jesus basically steps in and says, it's all about me. And this is important for you to note because Jesus doesn't step in and say, hey, let me teach you some things that you need to believe in order to be able to get back to God. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't say, I can teach you how to get back to God. No, Jesus says, I can actually lead you back to God. I'm the way back. He specifically says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. And there are these moments where he steps in and says, no, it's all about me. I have all of the authority has been given to me, which is one of two things, either a phenomenally arrogant statement or it's true. Now, for those who are gathered in this moment, they have no problem accepting this. You know why they have no problem accepting this? Because they saw him crucified and now he's talking. And he says, all authority has been given to me. Okay, Jesus, you have all the authority. What is it that we're going to do? Listen to how he continues. He says, therefore, because of the fact that all authority is given to me, this is what it is that we're going to do. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Listen, guys, I told you I was going to die. I told you I was going to come back. And here's what it is that we're going to do. All authority has been given to me. Remember I told you about that ecclesia? Remember I told you about that movement? Remember I told you about that people? This isn't just going to be a Jerusalem thing. This isn't just going to be an Israel thing. This is going to be a world thing. And so here's what I want for you to do. I want for you to take my message to the world. And then he says this, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And then he leaves. I'm going to die. I'm going to come back to life. Okay, Jesus, what are we going to do with that? You are going to take this to the world. That prediction that I made, that promise that I told you about that ecclesia, that gathering, that movement, now you're going to take this to the world. And at first, as we talked about last week, these individuals who at one time were running for their life, at first they take it to the city of Jerusalem. And we talked last week about their message inside of Jerusalem and the fact that they step in and say, you killed him, God raised him, we've seen him, now say you're sorry. And as they begin to share that message, literally thousands of people place their faith in Jesus. One of the things that really separates the movement of Jesus from other religious movements is that it didn't start slow. It wasn't just a few people who started to believe and then it caught on a little bit and a few more people and a few more people, and over a couple hundred years it started to build. No. The movement of Jesus started fast. Why? Because it started with an event. And thousands upon thousands of people are beginning to place their faith in Jesus because most of these people had actually met Jesus. They'd actually seen, not only had they seen him work miracles, but that many of them had actually seen him after he'd come back from the dead. And so the movement catches fire. And it looks like, man, what Jesus promised was going to happen, it's actually going to happen. But then persecution breaks out. And all of a sudden it begins to be dangerous to talk about Jesus. And people are beginning to be put to death if they talk about Jesus. And the disciples had traveled a little bit to share this message, but the reality is that the disciples don't actually do what it is that they're supposed to do. And rather than taking this message to the world, they stay together inside of Jerusalem and they stay together in this area and they begin to be very focused on Jews only as opposed to doing what Jesus actually told them to do. And that movement that started really quickly all of a sudden looks like it's going to be hindered. And just as at the cross, it looks in this moment like, man, this really isn't gonna take off. This really isn't gonna be what Jesus said that it was going to be. Until Jesus steps into the life of a man named Saul. His name would be changed to Paul. But again, the disciples aren't doing what it is that they're supposed to do. And this is a tricky thing when it comes to the message of Jesus, because when you encounter Jesus, not only does he reconnect you with the Father, but when you place your faith in Jesus, he also changes the way that you connect with others. And I hear this all the time inside of our church family, and people will say, man, I've never experienced community like I have when I stepped into Hoboken Grace and the relationships that I've built. Because when you're on a spiritual journey together, it's remarkably powerful. And it can be really easy for us to just value that connection. But Jesus steps in and says, no, that's not how this works. As a matter of fact, I want for you to always be willing to sacrifice connection for the purpose of multiplication. And so he says to his disciples, I want for you to sacrifice the connection that you have for the purpose of multiplication. But they don't actually listen, and it looks like it's not going to work out. But then he steps into a life of a guy named Saul. And I love the story of Paul because, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, God decides to use someone who not only communicates the message of grace, but who literally embodies it. Because this is the very person who was killing Christians. This is the one that everyone was afraid of. As a matter of fact, when Paul first becomes a believer, God sends someone to go speak to him, and the person is afraid to go because he actually thinks that Paul is faking being a believer so that he can find out who is a believer so that he can have them all put to death. And God says, okay, no. I'm going to use the one who hates me the most. So that not only will he communicate the message of grace, but he will literally be the perfect illustration of it. And so he steps into Paul's life, and Paul begins to move throughout the entire Roman Empire. And he begins to plant all these little gatherings, all these little ecclesias. And in city after city, this movement begins to catch fire. It begins to spread not just through Jerusalem, not just through the surrounding area, but it begins to spread through the entire known world. To the point where it not only catches the attention of religious leaders, it catches the attention of the emperor himself. For 30 years, Paul takes this message through the Roman Empire. Until finally, in his early 60s, he's put into prison in Rome. The first time that he's put into prison, they actually let him out. The second time, Nero's in charge. And one morning, they come for Paul. They came for him. They let him down the Roman Forum. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it before. It looks like this today. You've been there. And they let him out of the city to be executed. A short time later, Peter would be crucified upside down in Rome as well. And I've heard people talk about when Paul was executed, and I've heard them ask, can you imagine what it would be like for Paul to see Rome today? Because at the point where Paul is put to death, Nero himself had basically declared war on the movement of Jesus. And not only were the religious leaders working with all that they had to be able to end this movement, but now Rome itself was working to end the movement of Jesus. And I've heard people ask, can you imagine what it would have been like to be Paul being led out of this city with all of this display of Roman power, but for him to come back today and to see what has happened? And for him to be able to see that as you move through the city of Rome today, you see cross after cross after cross after cross after cross, but not as a symbol of Roman power, but as a symbol of the message of Jesus. For you to be able to share with Paul, listen, Paul, you need to understand something. Yes, I understand what Nero's doing to Christians today, but in the very place where Nero is literally sacrificing Christians to be killed by lions, one day they're going to build one of the most beautiful buildings on the planet in honor of Peter. And Paul, you wouldn't believe it, but one day, thousands upon thousands of people are going to travel to this city. And as they make their way through the forum, they're going to ask their tour guide, not about Julius Caesar, not about Tiberius. They're going to ask their tour guide, where is it that Paul was imprisoned? And Paul, even to this day, people name their kids Peter and Paul, and name their dogs Caesar and Nero. Paul, and the way that I've heard it is this. They say, can you imagine what it would be like for Paul to see it today? Can you imagine how surprised he would be? But here's the thing. I don't think for 1 second that Paul would be surprised. And here's why I say that. Because Paul knew that when Jesus makes a promise, he keeps it. Paul knew that when Jesus makes a prediction, he follows through. And I think if Paul would see what's happened, I think that Paul would say, I didn't know how it would happen, but I did know it would happen. I didn't know how it would work out, but I did know that it would work out. Why? Because Jesus said it would. And just as he said that he would die and he would come back to life, he promised that, no, I'm going to build my church. And not only did he promise that he's going to build his church, listen to how he continued. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or the gates of hell, will not overcome it. Jesus said, I promise you, this is what I'm going to do. Jesus, you've just given your life. You've just come back. You've just come back from the dead. What is it that you're going to do? How is it that you're going to change the world? This is how I'm going to change the world. this is what I'm going to do. And there are going to be all sorts of things that come against it. But I promise you, nothing will overcome it. This is what I'm going to do. As we come to the end of this series, I want for you to not only understand the prediction that Jesus made of his death and resurrection. I want you to understand the invitation that Jesus has made to every single one of us to be part of what it is that he's doing and to be part of what it is that he promised he was going to do and how he was going to change the world. You know, it's interesting. We could go around this room and I could ask each and every one of you, what is it that you love most about Jesus? I love being able to ask this question because people respond in all sorts of different ways. And some people will tell me, what I love most about Jesus is forgiveness and the fact that I'm free from my guilt and my shame and the fact that I'm free from my past. And other people will talk to me about Jesus' grace and just the amazing way that he gave above and beyond what, it's not just that I experienced mercy, but the incredible grace that I experienced. And some people will talk to me about the relationship and the fact that they don't have to be lonely anymore and that they know that he's constantly with them. And there's all sorts of different things based on how you're created and what it is that means the most to you about Jesus. You know what it is for me? It's the mission. It's the mission. It's that Jesus, as he stepped into my life, not only gave me the chance to be forgiven, but he gave me the chance to be part of what it was that he's doing to change the world. That he didn't just give me a chance to be with him. He gave me a chance to do something alongside of him. To actually live a life that's significant. To actually engage the journey in a way that matters. And as Jesus invites us into this faith journey, he doesn't just invite us to experience his grace. He invites us into his mission. To be part of his body that is changing the world. To be part of his body that he is building. There will be all sorts of things that come against it, but nothing will overcome it. We live our lives for so many different things. We invest our lives in so many different things. Most of them will last for the next 5, maybe 10, maybe 30 years. But God has stepped in and said, no. I want you to be a part of something more significant than that. I want you to be part of something that not only lasts the rest of your life. I want you to be part of something that lasts for all of eternity. One of the things that I'm excited about this morning is that we have the opportunity to be able to celebrate in baptism. And I love celebrating baptisms. I love celebrating what Jesus has done in their life. But I love being able to celebrate it together. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we used to do is that we used to do baptisms down at the shore. But we decided that we were going to go away from that for a couple different reasons. One, it's really dangerous. And when you do a baptism at the shore, you don't actually dunk anyone. You just stand there and wait for the wave to hit. And it just kind of does it for you, right? But the other reason is that we weren't able to do it together as a family the way that we wanted to. And the reason why we love to celebrate baptisms together as a family is because all of us are part of that story. And when you see this individual come today and take the step of baptism, if you've been a part of this church family and you've been a part of this mission with us, I want you to understand something. This is your story. And God has invited every single one of us. And oftentimes people will say, oh, you get to be a part of this because of the fact that you're a pastor. No. All of us are part of this together. And when it comes to sharing the message of Jesus, all of us get to do this together. And whether you're sharing it with the kids on the second floor or whether you're welcoming people when they walk in, I tell this to our greeters all the time. Most people make the decision about whether or not they're going to come back to a church within the first 5 minutes that they walk in the door. You know what that means? It means I have nothing to do with it. I can only screw it up. It has to do with how they're welcomed. It has to do with whether or not they feel at home. It has to do with whether or not they feel like they belong. All of us are part of this together. And as we celebrate this baptism, this is our story. And the fact that we get to be significantly part of changing this individual's future forever. Jesus says, no. This is what I'm going to do. And I want to invite you to be part of it. I want to invite you to be my body that takes my message to the world. And as we bring this conversation to a close, I want to make that invitation to you. To not just be impacted by his church, but to be his church. Many of you are here and you've been impacted by his church, but you haven't yet decided to be his church, to be part of how he wants to change the world. What's your next step? What's your next step? For some of you, your next step as we come to the end of this conversation is just to continue to pursue him, to figure out what this is about. You're at the beginning of your journey and you're not sure yet whether or not you can trust him. Your next step is to commit that, no, I'm going to continue on this journey. I'm going to continue to explore who he is and whether or not I can trust him. For others of you, you've actually come to the point where it's time for you to trust him. For you to say, no, I'm done trying to fix the mess myself. I trust you. For others of you, over the past few weeks, you've actually taken that step. You've trusted him for the first time. And your next step is the step of baptism. I want to invite you to do that today. As a matter of fact, Anthony is right back there by the back doors. He'll be out in the hallway. As we move forward, we're completely prepared for you to be able to take that step today. To not hesitate. To decide, no. Not only do I trust him, but I'm going to follow him. And I want to go public with who it is that I follow. As we move through the rest of the service, at any point, you can go back and talk with him about baptism and what that's about and how you can take that step today. For others of you, it's the step of deciding, no, I don't want to just be impacted by his church. I want to be his church. And whether that's you deciding to get into a dinner group or whether that's you deciding, no, I want to jump onto an impact team. I want my time and my talents and my treasures to be used by him to be able to continue what it is that he promised that he would do and what it is that he has been faithful to do the entire time. What's your next step on this faith journey? Will you trust him? Will you pray with me? Father, I pray that as we come to the end of this conversation, that you would make it very clear what our next step is. And for each of us, that's different, as we're at different places on this journey. But I pray that you make it very clear what it is that you're calling us into. I pray for those who are trusting you for the very first time. I pray that they would be overwhelmed by your love. I pray that they would be willing to not just trust you privately, but to publicly proclaim that, no, I'm following him. I pray for those who've stepped into that relationship, that they'd take that next step of being your church, of being part of what it is that you're doing to change the world. And most of all, Father, I thank you that just as you were faithful just as you were faithful with the prediction that Jesus would give his life and come back to life, that you have been faithful to build your church, to build your ecclesia, to build your family, and to use us as part of that. In Jesus' name, amen.